Welcome to See Jill Make, brought to you by the Devilish Egg. Today we are going to be refinishing a chair. Okay, so to get started, the first thing we're going to do is remove the seat cushion from the frame. And you can do this by taking the screws out that are down here at the bottom of the frame. They just go through the frame and hang on to the cushion below. This is what your frame looks like. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to start to prep the frame, because we're going to paint that and then we're going to wait for that to dry, and while we're waiting on the paint to dry, we're going to reupholster the cushion. So the first thing that you need to do whenever you are refinishing furniture is to sand it. You don't have to sand all of the original finish off, but what's important is that you scuff up the finish enough so that the new paint can hang on to it. So I'm using 120 grit sandpaper. That's a pretty good medium grit to use. You don't want to use something fine like 220 or higher than that, because it's just going to not do a great job for you. All right, so now I have my completely sanded chair, and the next step is to dust it off, and then I'm also going to take a wet tack cloth and I'm going to wash it down just a little bit, just a damp one, not like super wet, just to make sure that we get all the remaining dust off, because you don't want dust mucking up the new paint. So we're going to do that and then we'll come right back. So I have wiped all of the dust off of my chair with a brush, and now I'm going to go back with a tack cloth, which is just a fancy way of saying a wet cloth. This is a paper towel. So okay, now that I have it cleaned off, I am ready to put some paint on it. When you purchase paint for your project, you want to make sure that it's the kind that has primer in it. If you don't get a paint with primer, then make sure that you put a primer coat on. I know it seems like a pain in the butt. However, it is actually a really important step, especially when you're refinishing something, because the primer is going to do a much better job of hanging onto that wood than the regular paint. And if you don't have it, it's just not going to stick very well. So we're going to start with one light coat of paint. And you can kind of tackle this however you want to, so you have the whole thing covered. And it's always better to do 2 light coats than 1 heavy coat, just because you're going to get fewer brush marks, streaks. It's going to dry faster. It seems like 1 coat would be faster, but it's really not. You want to do 2 light coats. Okay, so I'm going to give that a little bit of time to dry. A note about paint. The paint that I'm using is just a regular latex paint. It's like a wall paint. The finish that this one comes in is a satin. That's because this is a sample. There is enough paint in here for me to probably do a whole dining set. So getting a sample of the color that you want is a really economical way to go about getting a custom color. Semi-gloss is usually the kind of finish that's used for furniture and cabinetry. So if you want something that's going to wear a little bit better, semi-gloss is the way to go. If this is just going to be kind of in the corner and not a lot of people are going to touch it, it's okay to go with the satin finish if that's what your paint comes in. But if you're getting paint mixed up at the store and you have a choice, definitely get semi-gloss. Okay, so the next component we're going to work with is our cushion. This is a really simple assembly. There is a board on the back into which everything is nailed. There is some padding on the top, and then that's covered by a piece of fabric. So the first thing that you want to do is to try and get all of the original upholstery off. Okay, so now I have gotten the original upholstery free of the backing. I'm going to turn this over and I'm going to try and peel this off of the cushion that is on there already. So now we've got the old upholstery off. I'm going to get rid of that. Going to kind of smooth everything out here. And then we're going to get our batting. So I have cut this batting already to be the right size to go on this. This will help kind of smooth out any imperfections in the base material. Also gives it a little bit more fluff because over time the loft can get kind of worn out of old pieces of upholstery. So with my staple gun, and I really recommend that you have a staple gun for this. You don't want to just go at it with a stapler. If that's the only thing you have, you know, you can try it, good luck, but you really need something that's going to secure the staple into the wood the way a staple gun will. And so I'm just tacking this down right now so that I get a nice smooth finish. And then I'm going to go back and I'm going to trim off the excess. And this doesn't have to be particularly tidy because we're going to go back and really pull the upholstery fabric over it to get the smooth finished product. But this just sets us down a good base. So, and you'll notice too that almost all of the tacks are still in here. I'm not going to take the time to try and get them out because they're really not in the way. As long as I can still staple in my upholstery and my batting, they're really not, there's really not a good reason to take them out. You know, unless you're just neurotic and you can't stand the idea of them being there. Nobody's ever going to see them again. Okay, so now we have our batting on. It's nice and tight across the whole thing, but I didn't pull it really tight. It's just taut. Okay, so the next thing you're going to do is you're going to take your fabric, and this I have not cut because the pattern that I have got has a really large graphic on it. And so pattern placement for a graphic like this is really important. So I'm leaving it till now to be able to tell exactly where I want this pattern to go. If you have a very thin, small pattern or repeat, you don't have to do this as much. One thing that you do want to remember though, is if you have a pattern that's a stripe or has some kind of an obvious repeat, you really want to try and get a stripe down the middle. So it's not offset or turned or a little bit funky when you look at it. So I want my birds to show, but there's not quite enough room for them here. So I'm gonna have to go to the next set, which is further down or further up. We'll see. All right, so this looks like it's gonna be the most economical placement for me. So I want these little birds to be right in the middle here. So I am going to roughly cut out the size of my seat plus a couple of inches, maybe 4. So that we can wrap it around and still have So now we're going to start the process of stapling our upholstery on. First, I want to check how it's going to look once I get it all tucked in where everything's going to go and make sure that's how I want it. So I actually think I want these birds to come up just a hair. I'm going to flip that over, and starting on the straight side, I'm going to start stapling. Now, notice that I want to staple beyond where my batting is because I don't really want to see that poking out. Evenly all the way across. And then the next thing I'm going to do is come to the other side, the opposite side, and I'm going to pull it. And I'm going to start in the middle. You always want to start this kind of thing in the middle so that you can work your way out. And when I'm pulling this fabric, I'm not pulling on it super hard. I just want it to be taut. You don't want it to be as tight as humanly possible because what that's going to give you is depressions on the top side of your fabric, because if you're pulling it really tightly in one area, it's going to pull all of those fibers this way and you're going to end up with a little valley, which is definitely not what you want. Okay, so I'm going to check to make sure I'm doing good here. Everything looks nice and even and smooth. So we're going to continue on to the next side. Take a look, make sure this looks nice and flat and even. I don't see any places where there's any tension or puckering, so that means we are doing a good job. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to come back and make sure that we have even spacing with our staples. There's not any holes in our lines. And then we're going to trim our fabric and finish up. Okay, so you can see this is a lot bigger margin than this one. I'm just going to cut this off so that it's closer to the staples. One thing you don't want to do not cut it right up to the staples, because the fabric is keeping that staple in there, and if you get too close to where the tension is, you're actually going to pull the pieces of warp and weft out, and so your fabric will actually unravel, and you don't want that to happen. So and I'm just going to come back and I'm going to tuck my corners in so that I can clean those up and they'll look nice. There's a lot of extra fabric here. It's just bulk. So I'm going to cut that off before I get started. So, and there's no real rhyme or reason to how I'm getting these things folded under. I'm just trying to basically manage the bulk and then make it look neat. I'm sure somewhere in an upholstery manual somewhere there is explicit instructions on how to do this exactly right, but we're gonna wing it. So now we have the bottom upholstered. So if you noticed originally when we first started with the original seat, it had a black mesh over this area. They sell that fabric and you can get that if you want to have the back side of it looking really finished. Nobody is going to see the back side of my chairs, so it's not really a big deal to me. It's totally up to you. You can also take piping or braid if you want to and hot glue that down to your seams if that's important to you, how that looks. Again, nobody's gonna see the bottom of my chair, so I am not gonna do that. Okay, so welcome back to day 2 of our chair refinishing project. This has dried overnight. It ended up needing about 3 coats of paint in order to cover up the old dark stain. That's because of the depth of the color of this particular paint. If you had a paint that had a white base, you probably would only need 2. You don't have to leave it overnight if you don't want to, but in this case, I thought it would be better. So the next thing that we're going to do is we are going to do some techniques where we are distressing and we're texturizing. So the first one that I'm going to do is a rub, where we're basically going to emphasize all of the nooks and crannies in this top rail. And to do that, we're going to use black paint, and we're going to do a technique where you wipe it on, or you brush it on, and then you wipe it off. So basically all of the high spots, the paint gets taken off of, but all of the low spots, it stays in. So get ready for that. All right, so here we are with our black paint. Just gonna get a little bit of that on, and I'm gonna work in sections. So to begin with, I'm gonna start smoothing that on and pressing the paint into all of the crevices. Because we want this to look like it's been around for a long time, and so we all know that all that stuff collects in the nooks and crannies. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take a dry paper towel and I'm going to wipe off as much as possible. Once I have done that, I'm going to go back with a wet paper towel. I have my little bowl of water over here so that I can work on getting more of that off. And this is where the finish of your base paint helps, because this has some sheen on it. The black paint doesn't stick as much to it. If you had a flat paint, it would definitely stick more and it would be harder to get off. So just keep that in mind when you're doing this kind of technique, that the underlying paint really needs to have some sheen to it if you want it to work. Okay, so again, I'm working in sections. And the wonderful thing about this is, if you do this and you mess up a part, it's paint. You can just paint back over it again. So if you do part of the black and you look at it and you're like, wow, that did not turn out the way I wanted, just go back over it with your original paint and try again. You can see that there's a little bit of black here, but it's completely pristine over here. So I'm going to take one of these rags that I've used and just kind of hit it a little bit so that we've got a little bit of that patinaed look on the rest of the chair. So at this point, you could stop here and go ahead and put your upholstery on, and this could be done if you wanted to. However, we are going to add another layer of distressing. We're going to add a dry brush layer of white. So that's actually going to pick up all of the highlights. So we've emphasized all the low lights right now. We're going to pick up the highlights with the dry brush technique. And then after that, we're actually gonna go back and sand and distress it a little bit, so stay tuned. Okay, so the next part of our technique is gonna be dry brushing. And this is a super easy technique, and it basically is what it sounds like. You take a brush, and this is just your regular standard chip brush. They're really inexpensive, probably $1, maybe $2 if you're shopping someplace expensive. But they are great because they've got these really irregular bristles. So that helps us a lot when we're doing the dry brushing. When you do this, you want to just get a little bit of paint on the tip of your brush, and then you're going to wipe it all out essentially so that you have a dry brush. So after you've done that, you're going to just gently start drawing it across your piece. It will hit all of the highlights, and you will get that distressed look. All right, so I'm running out of paint. So what I do is go back and do the same thing I started with. I just put a tiny bit on the brush, and then you wipe almost all of it out. And then you just start drawing it across again. So, and brush stroke matters here because you notice I'm going in the direction of the grain of the piece of wood. So you want to try and not sort of cross over unless you want a crossed hatched look, which you can, you can do that. It would look like this. And it just depends on how much of the white you actually want on your piece. So it's really interesting actually with this technique, you can take a piece like this one, which is really pretty dark at this point from the different colors that we have put on it, and make it nearly white, just with the amount of dry brush that you do on it. So if when you're doing your paint, you're like, wow, this is darker than I thought, or when you're doing your black, if it turns out way darker than you thought, you can always come in a little heavier with your dry brush. Okay, so now we have both of our distress finishes on the chair. If you like it like this, you can leave it like this, put your cushion on, and go about your business. If you want to even make it more distressed looking, we can take some sandpaper and we're going to sand down all of the high points. And what you want to think about when you're sanding is where would the chair get wear over time? So where are people going to touch it? They're going to touch it along here with their backs when they sit in it. They're going to be touching it up here when they pick it up. It's going to get touched down here when it runs into things. It's going to get touched down here when people kick it. So there are some strategic points to kind of pay attention to when you're sanding so that it looks authentic. So, and I have a couple pieces of sandpaper here. When you're doing this, it's very easy for the sandpaper to get clogged. Therefore, you want to have a lot of sandpaper. Sandpaper is cheap, your time is not. So when you get a clogged piece of sandpaper, just go on and move on to the next one because it's not worth trying to eke every tiny little bit out of the sandpaper. Okay, so I'm going to start with this edge right here. I know it's going to get lots of wear from people sitting in the chair, getting in and out. And one of the nice things about this part of it is if you feel like you've overdone it with the white or whatever top color you use, this is a great way to kind of tone that down some because you can sand it off. You can also do this with an electric sander, which is a lot faster, although you have to be a little more careful with it because If you get a little overzealous with the electric sander, you can sand right through your paint really quickly. All right, so overall, I am pretty happy with the way this turned out. The next step is to go get all the sanding dust off of it. If you want to leave it as is, you can. It's got sort of that worn matte sort of look to it. If you want to protect the finish a little bit more than that, I would recommend either getting a brush on or a spray on polyurethane. Personally, I like spray on because it just is a lot easier. But do that outside in a really well ventilated area. So the next thing to complete the project, if you were going to finish it, obviously do it in polyurethane. After that, the next thing to do is to go ahead and put the cushion on. Okay, so the last phase of our project is upon us. It is time to put our newly refinished cushion onto our newly refinished frame. Now, if you haven't added too much padding, it really shouldn't be real hard to put it back on there again. The tricky part of this is the fact that you have now covered the existing holes that were drilled in the bottom to hold this onto the frame with new fabric. So a lot of people's original impulse is to just try and drill right through it. I can tell you from experience that works about 10% of the time. So what you're going to need to do is you're going to have to turn the chair over. We'll figure out exactly where your cushion's going to go. And then you're going to have to mark where these holes are that the screws go into. So I had quite a bit of white paint left over. So what I'm going to do is just coat the ends of my screws in white paint. And I'm going to put them through the hole and try to mark where that is on the back side. All right, so hopefully those have all made contact with the back, and we can pull that out and see if we've got our marks where we need them. What do you know? It worked. So I've got a mark here, there, there, and there. So now we know exactly where we need to cut our fabric and potentially drill new holes. Okay, so keeping my screws so I don't lose them. I am going to cut the fabric in the spots where we have marked, because otherwise we'll never get the screws through. And this one just so happens to be right on a staple, so I may take that up and put another one in a little bit further away. Oh, there's another one over there, look at that. When you're doing things like this, notice I started out like this with my hand right here and I'm pushing towards my hand. when I realized I was doing that, I moved my hand over here. You always want to think about where your tool is and where the force is going, and if you miss, what's behind that. I don't want to gouge my hand with this, so it works just as effectively to hold it over here. So I can do this without having to worry about injuring myself. So a little bit of forethought can save you a trip to the emergency room. Who knew crafting could be so dangerous? All right, now that we have all of our holes exposed, we are ready to go ahead and assemble this thing. So again, I'm going to put this, oh man. Okay. Well, prime example of why you should always keep a clean workspace. I have just gotten white paint smack in the middle of my seat. Sometimes that's the way it goes. Okay, so I'm going to turn this over. Actually, I'm going to put the cushion on first. And what I'm looking for is I'm trying to see these holes that I made through the holes where the screws are going to go so that I know I'm lining it up. So that's pretty close. So now I'm going to screw the screws in. So if we're lucky, we can do it with just our regular old screwdriver that we started with. If you're having trouble finding the holes or it's not going in, you can always get a drill. All right, we are in. So again, keep a clean workspace. Not setting a very good example. Here we go with our finished project. Is put together, got our seat on, and it's ready to go. Thanks for joining me for this episode of See Jill Make. Stay tuned to see me make a bunch of other things, and if you enjoyed this video and found it helpful, please like and subscribe. Thanks a bunch. I'll see you next time.